This time it's 5 yet more motorcycle disasters. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. What constitutes a motorcycle disaster? Sometimes it's bad design, sometimes bad timing, and sometimes it's something as simple as quality control. Here's 5 more motorcycling disasters. The oil and frame triumphs. We begin with a slightly unusual disaster, because this time it's not specifically about the bike. Well, unless you count the slightly too high seat and those slightly dodgy conical hubs. The problem here was in producing the machine in the first place. BSA and Triumph have been gradually falling behind the Japanese onslaught in the late 60s. What they really needed was an all-new engine and a new ground-up design. The fact was, BSA and Triumph chassis were pretty darn good by the late 60s. The engines, however, were definitely beginning to show their age. So, what did BSA and Triumph do? Well, they did introduce the triple, but for the rest of the range, rather than build an all-new parallel twin, they developed a completely new chassis. This was an oil and frame design, where the top tube of the frame and the down tube, specifically in this case, carried the oil. This is quite a neat design and had originally been seen in the off-roaders, particularly around the 250s and scrambles bikes of the late 60s. But where the problem came was when they came to introduce the new chassis to the Triumphs, because the bloody engine didn't fit. This caused a fairly lengthy delay in the production of the machines overall, and this carried right through the selling season of 1971. This meant that for several months, new Triumphs simply were not available on the market. The result was a financial disaster, and this, coupled with some other poor decisions made at the time by the company, played a major part in the collapse of BSA Triumph Group. The Indian Scout Model 249 and 250. The early post-war years were not particularly happy ones for the Indian Motorcycle Company. However, in 1945, a guy called Ralph B. Rogers took control of the Indian Motorcycle Company. He brought in designer G. Briggs Weaver, and in 1944 he'd already started work on a parallel twin. Now, quite why they decided on a parallel twin is hard to define. It's probably because it's seen the success that Triumph had in the British market and wanted to emulate that same success in the American market. Quite why they didn't produce an overhead valve V-twin is unknown, but I guess they just wanted to start with something completely new. It's said that Rogers spent upwards of $500,000, a fortune back in 1945 it must be said, on retooling and redevelopment of an all-new range for Indian. And the new Scout 249 was a major part of this. Now, the 249, of course, applies to cubic inches rather than cc's. It's actually around 440. Although the design looks fairly neat, although I have to say the left-hand side with all its oil pumps and tubing doesn't look particularly tidy. And on the right-hand side, the primary drive had a few design faults too, because there was no tensioner for the primary drive chain, and this tended to wear fairly quickly and get very sloppy. But the major issue for this machine was basically one of quality control. Suppliers had let the company down, and they'd been left bereft of parts to construct their machines, even their older models. This meant that the finances began to run very short, and 1,650 people were laid off from the Springfield plant. They really needed to start to get machines out the door, so to save money, they began to cut corners. This can be particularly seen in the Magneto, This had been designed for a single-cylinder engine, and so it didn't provide reliable sparks, making the bike rather difficult to start. Amazingly, 2,000 machines left the factory without grease being applied to their wheel bearings, with predictably disastrous results. Some gearboxes had mismatched gear teeth, and with, again, disastrous results for the gearbox, which simply wouldn't select. To make matters worse, the company had spent a small fortune on promotion, using Hollywood stars in advertising campaigns. The results were fairly predictable, and fairly rapidly the company went bankrupt and was taken over by Brockhouse Engineering. But that, as they say, is another story. Moto Guzzi Lavio. Now, Moto Guzzi's Lavio series, or in fact whole series of 4-valve engines, these stretched from 400 all the way up to the 650 Lavio, which you can see here, fits very much into the "it seemed a really good idea at the time" category. By the mid-80s, Guzzi's small block engines were beginning to look rather old-fashioned and were certainly falling behind in the power stakes. So, let's just fit a 4-valve head to the things. What could be simpler? So that's exactly what Guzzi did. They designed their own 4-valve head and grafted it onto the top of the small block engines. The problem was that the design of the 4-valve head wasn't exactly perfect. The result was a series of cracks that could be found around the valve seats, and even worse still, the most common fault probably, would be that valves would simply snap at the stem and drop into the engine. This would of course lead to catastrophic engine failure. This is a great shame because the Lavio was a rather brilliant design. It handled very nicely, was lively and light, made around 60 horsepower, which doesn't seem a great deal now, but that was a pretty good figure for a 650 twin back in 1985. Top speed was up around the 120 mph mark, which was pretty much as quick as the much larger big block twins that were also being produced by the company. The Lavio did look, at least for a time, as if it was pointing to the future. But in the end, it led nowhere. Yes, and by popular demand, it's Yamaha's TX range of 500 and 750 parallel twins. The TX range was designed as the replacement for the venerable old XX650 range. This bike was going to be the future. Yamaha had made great play about fitting balance shafts into the engine, which they housed deep in the bottom of the crankcase. As it turned out, this was not their best move. The bob weights thrashed around and frothed up all the oil. This had fairly predictable results. You wonder why Yamaha didn't pick up on this initially. Frankly, they were quite surprised when the frothy oil didn't supply the engine very well with oil. It will surprise nobody to learn that pretty much everything else in the engine failed due to a rather crap oil supply. The thing ran hot, all the bearings wore out, the crank failed, the top end didn't do well either, and generally the engine was a load of old crap. Bit of a shame because it was a very nice piece of design. They just put the bob weights in completely the wrong place. Looked great though, didn't it? The Triumph Bandit and BSA Fury. Now, Edward Turner, Triumph's former managing director and chief of design, was a rather brilliant but somewhat dictatorial character. But he had been retired for some years when in 1968, for some reason the Triumph management invited him back to design a new lightweight parallel twin. The 350cc capacity was becoming extremely popular in the United States, and Triumph wanted a piece of it. So they asked the old designer to come back and design one last machine. Now, it should be noted at this point that Turner was not actually a qualified engineer, and this shows up in the prototype because it's rather skimped in its general design. The little engine was shoehorned into a lightweight Triumph Tiger 200 chassis. It was said that the machine would hit nigh on 100 miles an hour, but the fact was, it actually wouldn't do that for very long. It vibrated horribly, it ran roughly, and the crankshaft was never going to live very long at all. So Doug Heel was brought in to finish off the design. Now Doug wasn't particularly keen on the design, to be honest. He got his own range of machines that he wanted to introduce to replace Triumph and BSA's rather aged line of engines which they've been using for a number of years. But ultimately, the management left him with no choice. And he started work, although admittedly rather steadily, on refining the design into a workable machine. This actually took some considerable time. Money was becoming fairly scarce at this point at BSA Triumph. The chassis, for example, wasn't actually specifically designed for this machine, and you can see that the engine doesn't fit in particularly well. The engine itself used a modern double overhead cam layout. There's also proper wet sump and used a 180-degree crankshaft, just like the Japanese were using at that point. But other parts of the design still look distinctly archaic. And the long, twisty run of that cam chain really does suggest that that was going to give problems in fairly short order down the line. One of the big problems that the bike encountered actually was that the points kept wearing out. This seems a fairly small matter, but given the finances of the company, it seems to take an inordinate amount of time to fix. Money was spent in advertising, and a lot of work was done to tool the factory up to get the thing running. None of this work was ever actually completed. And in the end, the money ran out long before a workable version was ever released. A number of prototypes still survive today, some of which don't actually have any internals in them. I think this is a very interesting design, but ultimately, BSA and Triumph were simply not in a financial position to retool and completely redesign a machine in this way. If you want to learn more about these machines, I suggest you check out Angus Campbell's YouTube channel. He's been restoring a couple of these machines and really has a great deal of knowledge about these bikes. Well, I do hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. And of course, thank you very much for watching.